Morning. My name is Deanna Burgart, and I'm really excited to be here. And I just wanted to thank the conference for having me today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Indigenous voices and energy. And so we'll get started here. And I look forward to the Q&A later. So as I get started, I would like to take the opportunity first to acknowledge that I am currently on the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7, so which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda Nations, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I am from Treaty 8, from Fond du Lac First Nation. My relatives are from Fond du Lac and Fort Chipewyan. And so I'm really honored to have spent most of my life here in Calgary in Treaty 7 territory. And just wanted to share a little bit about my background. But before that, I want you to just consider where you're coming from. Wherever you are in Alberta, take a moment to think about the traditional territory that you're on. It's so important as people working in energy, or if you are engineering students, or if you're looking at working in areas that impact development and infrastructure, to understand that we live and work in projects that take place in traditional territories, territories that have been cared for since time immemorial by the First Nations, Métis, and or in the North, Inuit people of those traditional territories. So the first step is to know how to find out whose traditional territories you are. And there's a number of different ways you can do that. There is a website, and I've put the link in the slides, and I'll make the slides available to you after. But nativeland.ca, native-land.ca, territory acknowledgement, you can type your address in the search bar to find your the traditional territories in which you are working or living. So I am an engineer, but I have self-identified as an Indigeneer for a number of years. And I came up with this term in 2008, and I was speaking to Indigenous youth about careers in engineering and in energy, and I realized that the narrative was very polarized. You were either for Mother Earth, or you were for or you pursued a career in energy or in engineering. And I realized that I had already spent 10 years in oil and gas, focused on environmental compliance and regulatory compliance and reducing impact and reducing risk to air, land, and water. And so I I defined it as combining scientific principles with Indigenous perspectives of interconnectedness and respect for Mother Earth. And was really trying to find a way to bring those concepts into the work that I was doing in oil and gas. And as I went down this journey, I felt pretty isolated at the beginning until I joined organizations like the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, and found other Indigenous engineers around across Canada and the United States, and even New Zealand and Australia, and found that we actually shared a lot of the same perspectives on bringing our traditional ways of looking at the world and our passion for caring for the land and interconnectivity into the work that we do as engineers. And I started to realize and really think that those perspectives, if we brought them into mainstream development projects and into industry and into engineering, I really felt like it could be that catalyst to transform the way we do things. When we talk about United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, energy transitions, reducing impact on the environment, addressing climate change, that Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing could really be the catalyst to finding better solutions for everyone. And so that's when I started to explore more. And I was also on my own personal journey. I am a 60 Scoop adoptee. And so if you're not familiar with the history of Indigenous people in Canada, which is actually a shared history with many other countries and nations that were colonized. We after the residential school, the last residential school closed in 1996, but also through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there was a movement to remove Indigenous children from Indigenous homes and place them into non-Indigenous homes. So I was adopted out and raised by my parents, who are Scottish Canadian and French Canadian ancestry. And my dad worked in oil and gas. So I spent my entire childhood in that environment. And when I was 22, I found my birth mother. And that's when I really started to reconnect with my culture and begin that journey of reconnection, that I know I'm not the only one that's on it because of our history. And so when we talk about reconciliation in engineering or in energy, it has a very personal meaning to me in terms of my journey. And the seven sacred or Anishinaabeg or grandfather teachings have been such a guide for me through this journey. And those are love, respect, courage, honesty, wisdom, humility, and truth. And so as we go forward, and you know, if we were in a group setting, I would pause and give you the opportunity to turn to the person on your left or speak with your table or wherever you're at. But we can't do that in this environment. So I just hope that you will reflect reflect as I go forward to your own reactions and to your own thoughts, and what's coming up for you as you hear this, because I really think that Canada is ready for this conversation, and I'm hearing um, a shift in the conversations, and it's super exciting. So I want to share a little bit of the things that I've been involved in, and that I'm excited is happening. So a little bit of a background for folks that might be new to this conversation. I use the term Indigenous, and when I say Indigenous, um, it's not an identity for one person to say. It's an umbrella that encompasses and is all inclusive of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in Canada. The terminology is really important and evolving. You may still hear Aboriginal, and it's still a term that's used in legal contexts around Aboriginal rights and treaty rights. But Indigenous is becoming more the preferred term to be inclusive. When it comes to working directly with a nation or directly with an Indigenous person, it's really important to focus on how they self-identify. Self-determination and sovereignty is so important. I identify as a First Nations woman. I'm Cree Dene, and I don't speak for all Indigenous people. So it's important to me to preface this conversation with, I am bringing my own personal perspective and my journey and things that I've learned along the way. But I don't speak for all Indigenous people in Canada, and I am really passionate about creating space for different perspectives. Métis, it's important to recognize that there's separate and distinct cultures and identities today. And I don't, I'm of mixed ancestry. I'm First Nations and Irish, but I don't identify as Métis. So it's important to allow folks that do identify as Métis to define, a lot of it is not just blood quantum or ancestry, but a connection to community and a distinct culture. Inuit people in Canada are people of the North, singular is Inuk. And in Canada, Inuit live in the traditional territories of Nunavut, the northern third of Quebec, and Labrador, and parts of the Northwest Territories. And one thing that it's important for me to share is that Eskimo is considered a pejorative term. And so it's really important to understand that terminology and words really do matter. And I understand that it can be a little bit daunting if you're new to this conversation, but it's all part of growth and part of creating that ethical space. And we're going to talk about ethical space pretty soon here. And spaces of cultural safety is being willing to sit with discomfort of not knowing. and being willing to learn and being willing to misstep. I can tell you, in my 20-year journey from knowing nothing as an adoptee who grew up in Calgary and Singapore, I have misstepped many times. And it's only through the grace and welcoming forgiveness of folks that I have misstepped around, and the willingness to teach me, um, that has helped me continue forward and be okay with not knowing everything. And wow, with over 600 nations in Canada and over 500 nations in the United States, nobody knows everything about everyone. And so it's all being willing to create that space and honor different perspectives and different worldviews. So in 2016, I left the oil and gas industry after 20 years to start my consultancy, Indigenous Engineering Inclusion. And I was really looking for a way to, and if you've been in industry, you may recognize the term operationalize Indigeneering. And in 2017, this amazing document came out from the Alberta Energy Regulator. And I highly recommend, if you want to learn more about this, that you look it up. It is available publicly. And the Alberta Energy Regulator worked with Elder Dr. Reg Croshu. And it was the very first time I'd ever heard the terminology around ethical space and cultural safety. And it just made so much sense. And one of the biggest learnings that I took away and that I continue to try to remind myself is it's not about bringing Indigenous perspectives and just integrating it into a Western structure and Western power and hierarchy and Western ways. It's about creating ethical space for Indigenous oral culture, Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing to equitably coexist in parallel with Western written culture. It's about honoring different worldviews. Um, so as this is an excerpt from Voices of Understanding, ethical space may not be a familiar term. It's a new concept for the AER, and it's not easy to define. When we work to understand a perspective that is different from our own, and then examine that understanding with an eye to finding connections with our own perspective or our own worldview, we begin to create ethical space. The key is to link these worldviews in a way that does not diminish either and that honors both. This new way, which reflects a deep understanding of varying perspectives and values, can result in an ethical space that transforms the way that we work together. And when I started to really take the steps, I mean, when I first read this in 2017, I didn't really understand what that could look like, because I'd spent 20 years in the corporate world. I spent 20 years in a very Western environment, Western structures, Western hierarchies, Western education. And how do we create that ethical space, and what does that look like? And so I had to start doing some research on myself around terminology. What is Indigenous knowledge? What is traditional knowledge? I started learning that traditional knowledge, sacred teachings, were passed on through ceremony, orally. They were bound by songs and cultural protocols. They were community specific, and there were rules and protocols around who can share that knowledge, who can teach that knowledge. So I'm not coming to you as an traditional knowledge keeper. I like the difference or the comparison here. Jennifer Wemmick-Wands kind of defined the difference between sacred teachings and personal knowledge, Indigenous personal knowledge. Whereas I have knowledge that I've accumulated through my own education and study, gifts that I may have been born with, gifts received through revealed knowledge or dreams or visions or intuitions. Those aren't bound by cultural protocols, but I may learn traditional knowledge from an elder or a knowledge keeper, and it's not my place to share that knowledge. So it's important as we, in energy, start walking down listening to elders and co-creating projects with Indigenous knowledge keepers, particularly in the area of, say, pipelines and working with Indigenous monitors and that sort of thing. Really understanding that just as in the Western world, we have intellectual property, we have copyrights, we have trademarks. In Indigenous knowledge, there's protocols. There may be songs, there may be guidelines on what can and cannot be shared, and so it's really up to the elder and the knowledge keeper, and it's a case by case basis. It's important when we start talking about incorporating Indigenous knowledge that we understand what cultural appropriation is and commodification. And so, in a broader sense, it's pan-indigenizing sacred symbols and practices without acknowledging where they are from or getting permission from the nation. So there's a lot of discourse and conversations around buying or using sage and burning sage, smudging in a way that's not in alignment with traditional teachings. You may have heard in the news backlash about wearing headdresses at music festivals, dressing up as Native for Halloween. There's a number of movements around our culture is not your costume. But also pan-indigenizing Native-inspired products, buying dream catchers that are not made by traditional Anishinaabeg artisans. It's just really important to be aware of because this can come into our work as engineers and in development. So what does that look like in engineering or education or energy? It's the difference between co-creating with Indigenous knowledge keepers and elders and appropriating from and profiting from. It's research on Indigenous people and communities with and not with Indigenous people and communities. It's appropriation of sacred practices, items, or ceremony without the proper protocols or elder guidance. Or it's taking knowledge, information, or resources from traditional lands without giving back to the communities, without that reciprocity. It can also be only acknowledging accomplishments and contributions in a Western way. When I bring Indigenous knowledge keepers or elders into my classroom or at the university, it's really important to me to acknowledge and honor their time, their energy, and their emotional labor in an Indigenous way with gifts and honoraria and protocols around that. It's appropriation is implementing Indigenous initiatives for profit or to get grant funding as opposed to really wanting to co-create with Indigenous people. It's inviting Indigenous peoples to join a project or research or really any initiative at the 11th hour. It's creating checkbox exercises as opposed to co-creating with Indigenous people. And then these are a few ones that I want to talk about because there's a concept that I've discovered doing this work now for about 5 years, focused, is this is emotional labor. This is for Indigenous peoples. This is tied to intergenerational trauma. It's tied to intergenerational wisdom. It's tied to our own identity and our own healing journey. And part of that is realizing that you need to allow Indigenous people, employees, classmates, to really lead where and how they want to show up in this space. So not expecting Indigenous employees to focus only on Indigenous issues, initiatives, or inclusion efforts. It's not expecting Indigenous employees to carry the load in creating more inclusive spaces. We need to all work together to really define what ethical space looks like in our organizations or in our classroom. What does a space of cultural safety look like? In engineering and in oil and gas and in energy, safety is paramount. We're all very, very comfortable committing to creating a culture of safety. But oftentimes we only talk about physical safety, proper PPE, holding handrails, 3-point contact on ladders. All of that is super important. But there's also a deep importance on psychological safety, on spiritual safety, and emotional safety. And what if we all took accountability for all those parts, all those aspects of safety, not only for ourselves, but for our colleagues and for the spaces that we show up in. How can you take a role in creating spaces of safety beyond just physical? Expecting Indigenous colleagues or fellow students to do emotional labor constantly is something. Now, I'm not saying there's a lot of us folks in this space, Indigenous people that want to do this work, and it's really a passion. But understand that it is emotional labor, and so be willing to do some of that work yourself, and to go to Indigenous led spaces, to go to Indigenous led in events and presentations. And there's so many amazing podcasts coming out now. Listen to Indigenous voices on our terms, in our spaces. So I want you to just take a moment, because I feel like I've covered just, I don't know, check in. What's showing up for you? How can you take the lead? I was talking with my husband, who's also a pipeline engineer, and he has just recently updated his driving safety, took a driving safety course. And back in our day, and I'm not going to totally date myself, but we used to talk about defensive driving. And I guess the new terminology is proactive driving. I love that, because it's not being defensive when you're driving, it's proactively thinking ahead and managing risk moment to moment. How can you proactively create spaces of cultural safety? How can you proactively seek to create spaces of psychological, emotional, and cultural and spiritual safety for your colleagues, for your classmates, and for the people that you work with? So I'm going to give you about 10 seconds, 15 seconds to just kind of think on that. So when I say Indigenous self-determination in energy and engineering, it's making decisions and allowing Indigenous people to have a voice in decisions on how to capture Indigenous knowledge in industry, such as pipeline projects, environmental impact assessments. Allow it to be led by Indigenous peoples who hold and share that knowledge, and allow them to lead how that knowledge is captured and who can access it. We live in an industry where major projects become part of the public domain. And so, how do we make sure that we protect Indigenous knowledge in the way that it's meant to be held sacred, when it's meant to be held sacred? Capturing and sharing Indigenous knowledge in industry should equitably value Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing. So, that oral culture, that holistic showing up fully, mind, body, spirit, heart. Along with and separate from Western engineering codes and standards and Western environmental scientific practices. Indigenous peoples should always be included in work that impacts Indigenous peoples. To borrow a phrase from the disability community, nothing about us without us. And then finally, industry, I believe industry should seek to be more inclusive and welcoming to Indigenous peoples and perspectives to enhance project outcomes. So a little bit about what's happening at the University of Calgary. Itapatop is the overall Indigenous strategy at U of C. It means a place to rejuvenate and re-energize during a journey. I've been with the Schulich School of Engineering now full-time for a year, and prior to that was the first Indigenous engineer in residence. We now have a new Indigenous STEAM student club at the University of Calgary, which is led by some amazing students that are working to bring Indigenous students together in science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. We have a new Canada West professional student chapter of ACES, the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, which is growing and doing much more things in Canada. There's a national virtual gathering coming up on March 18th. If you're interested, please feel free to reach out and let me know. Cyber Mentor, which has been around for since 2004, I believe, now has an Indigenous initiative where led by an amazing Métis woman. I joined a year ago as teaching chair in Schulich School of Engineering, focused on weaving Indigenous knowledge and perspectives into engineering. And so I've brought that to the classroom level in 2 courses so far. One is a mandatory course that all engineers have to take. It's a course on technology and society. And an additional course that I'm currently teaching is environmental engineering and sustainability and energy. And how does that look like in the classroom? So my approach to creating ethical space, and what does that look like, has evolved over the years. And looking back, my early steps, I really misstepped in the sense that I was working within the constructs of my ability to change the structure. So I was bringing Indigenous perspectives in a very Western way of doing things. But as part of my own personal reconnection and understanding and evolution has happened over the past few years, I've been able to bring Indigenous knowledge keepers and elders to lead groups in an Indigenous way. So, for example, a couple of years ago, Indigeneer, which is a nonprofit uh, that I'm a part of, that works to connect Indigenous youth from kindergarten to grade 12 through post-secondary and into their professional lives, to create that community and connection. And we had a retreat, and um, came with a very Western agenda. And then that retreat was opened by Elder Reg and Rose Crowshoe, Elders Reg and Rose Crowshoe. And we sat in circle for the whole first morning. And then the second day, we had a very Western agenda. And by 10:30, we started out in circle, led by my birth mother, who started our circle with medicine wheel teachings. And we were about 50-50 Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks in science, technology, engineering, and math, and STEM education. And we started in circle with medicine wheel teachings, and we ended up spending the whole day. By 10:30 a.m., we basically put aside the planned agenda. And then, upon reflection at the end of the retreat, we realized we covered everything that we had set out to cover around how to best support Indigenous youth in STEM. We just covered it all in a different way. We covered it all by sharing our stories. We covered it all by showing up with our whole selves. So I took that learning, and I've worked to bring that into the classroom and encourage my students to show up with their whole selves, their physical, their mental, their emotional, and their spiritual self, to create safety, excuse me, for all those pieces. I've worked to incorporate the 7 sacred teachings in parallel with the Western classroom code of conduct and academic integrity, and sort of aligned 7 sacred teachings and those values with Western expectations of integrity and academic integrity in the classroom, and really challenged my students to think about what that looks like and how can they show up with integrity in every class. Creating brave spaces, equitable spaces, so we could have tough conversations. We're talking about the impact of technology in society. We're talking about sustainability and energy and environmental engineering and the role of an engineer in those spaces that can be very polarized. So how do we create equitable spaces for tough conversations and bringing differing viewpoints and challenging discourse? Creating opportunities for students to learn from a diverse perspectives, and elders and knowledge keepers and Indigenous engineering and environmental practitioners. And creating opportunities for students to experience Indigenous ways of sharing, such as elder-led talking circles. And I really want to challenge students to consider Indigenous perspectives and experiences in all the topics we discuss in the courses, not as like an add-on module. And then finally, I'm continually working to honor the Indigenous knowledge keepers and elders that come into my classroom in a good way, and honoring their their expectations, and honoring their emotional labor, and honoring the fact that they are not only bringing their professional stories, but they're bringing their personal identity, and how that's shaped their professional life. In the energy sector, there's some amazing things happening that I just wanted to share. YPAC, Young Pipeliners, I would like to give them a shout out. Kayla Marie Earle is one of the co-chairs of the Indigenous inclusion efforts of the Young Pipeliners Association. And so I really highly recommend that you check out some of the things that they're doing. I'm honored to be on the advisory committee, and I'm a fellow with the Energy Futures Lab. And we are really working to explore and examine how we can be a part of furthering the conversation around Indigenous leadership in energy and in energy transitions. And I just invite you to join us all in these conversations. And I really, really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you here today. I really hope that my internet cooperated. And I look forward to hearing your questions and starting the dialogue. And I challenge you as you go throughout the day. I know you've got some amazing speakers today and tomorrow. Annie Corver is doing great work with YPAC, and I think she's working on a panel later on that I am super excited to watch and to join in on. But really, reconciliation and creating ethical space, it really comes down to you and me and how we show up and how we choose to create space for these conversations, and how we choose to welcome Indigenous voices into the energy sector. Because I believe the more diversity we bring into the energy sector and into engineering and into these big, big challenges that we're facing globally, the more diverse voices and perspectives and worldviews, the more innovation will happen and will evolve. So thank you very much. And I look forward to your questions.
Hi, Christine. So we have a question that I posted in the chat.
Okay.
Essentially, it's saying that with respect to all the points and conversations spoke about today, in your opinion, how would be the best way to promote the online course? Aboriginal awareness to ensure understanding and respect and maintained within all industries, especially the oil and energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really good question. There's some great courses, like University of Alberta has a wonderful, accessible Aboriginal awareness course that I know the Young Pipeliners, I hope I can give them a shout out again, have encouraged all their members to take. But there's so many amazing resources out there. YouTube has videos. Bob Joseph, an amazing author, who has a website or a blog working effectively with Indigenous peoples. And I'm actually putting together a resource list. So if you are, if anyone is interested in some of the resources that I recommend, I'm happy to share them. So please feel free to reach out at any point in time. I think I can type in here. Indigisteam is relaunching our newsletter. It used to be my Indigeneering newsletter, but we're now using it to raise the voices of Indigenous initiatives and work in STEM across Canada and the US. So you can sign up for our newsletter there, but do feel free to reach out to me if you would like some of those resources. There's a lot out there. And one of the things that I get my students to do is search up reconciliation and TEDx and TED in YouTube, because there's amazing perspectives on decolonizing education and decolonizing spaces and how to do that ethically. And And so I think just encouraging your colleagues, creating space at work, or in your classroom. I come from oil and gas, where it's not uncommon to start a meeting with a safety moment. And so I start all my classes with a land acknowledgement. I start meetings with inclusion moments. I know other people have Indigenous moments, and are starting to bring those conversations. But so creating space in existing areas. So, for example, if you have safety moments at your organization, maybe personally come up with one that focuses on cultural safety or psychological safety, um, and just find ways to bring that into the conversation. As diversity and inclusion are hot topics currently, what are some current gaps within the industry that need a bigger Indigenous voice? um, I think our definition, our understanding of diversity, inclusion, and equity, and even accessibility, is something that I think an area that I'd love to see more conversations around. Um, so I mean, the way I look at it, diversity is bringing all those different perspectives, whether it's cognitive diversity, neurodiversity, whether it's where we grew up, the environment we grew up in, whether it's race, gender expression. We all bring diversity to the table. Inclusion is whether or not that table welcomes that diversity. I remember a quote from a book that I read years ago called The Loudest Duck. And one of the quotes was, "We hire for diversity, but then we fire because they're not the same." And that really, at the time, really stuck with me, because I'd spent 20 years trying to fit the mold of what I felt was expected of me. Um, I spent 20 years succeeding in a very Western construct and very corporate construct of what success looks like. So, where are the gaps? I think the gaps are, how do we create that space for inclusion? How do we create the space for equity? How do we create the space where those different viewpoints are actually welcome and encouraged, to foster creativity, to foster healthy conflict? How do we create trust-based spaces where we can have healthy conflict, which then can lead to innovation and better solutions for all? Um, yeah, someone said that unity and diversity can be learned from India. Such inclusivity and warmth can be observed. I'd love to learn more, hear more about that. I think that we can learn so much from cultures all over the world, and uh, we can seek out definitions. And I love that the term unity was used there, because I recently engaged in a conversation around medicine wheel teachings, um, around the medicine wheel representing unity externally, around the world, unity of wisdom, and unity of self. And I do think, I believe that when we find that unity of ourselves, when we are able to really bring our whole self together, we can create more spaces of unity in the organizations, in the groups that we're in our communities. I'm really excited to see all of the work that other folks are doing. Um, the best way to access the engineering course. So there's 2 engineering courses that I teach where I've really worked to create that space. One is offered to all engineering students at the University of Calgary. Um, and it's Engineering 481. And I will say that the only time at this point that it's taught in the way I described is when I am teaching it. And that's simply because it's one of those things that you can't just kind of design one, build many. But the other course is a specific course in the energy engineering program at University of Calgary. So that's a smaller place to access. But happy to hear from you if you're interested in it. These are brand new approaches, and it's continuously evolving as we explore this space. So, hoping that we can make them accessible to more and more folks that want to talk about these things in a different way. So I guess if there's no other questions, I want to thank the organizers. Oh, there's a question. Great. Are there other steps that can be taken to promote or enable more Indigenous entrepreneurship, whether it be within the energy sector or otherwise? I think really lifting voices of Indigenous people and Indigenous entrepreneurs. There's a lot more activity, and so creating space and showing up to events, events like the Forward Summit, events like that are Indigenous led. Can Do is another organization that brings Indigenous voices in business and in energy. I know I'm going to miss somebody, but there's Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business that lists certified Aboriginal businesses. The Government of Canada also has a procurement listing of Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs, and just really finding ways to amplify the voices of Indigenous people that are doing this work, and share some of the great things that are taking place all across Canada and the United States. Wow, that's a big question. Do I believe that we could, as a future humanity, be able to come together as one and unite all faiths, creating mutual respect? I have hope. I believe that we can, but I think we all have to want to. I think it is up to every individual. And from what we see out there, we're far from that. But unfortunately, I don't have any control over the polarization that I see and the narratives that I see around the world, around beliefs and faiths and political leanings, and it can get really frustrating and really discouraging. But then I realize that I do have control over the spaces that I'm in and how I show up, and it gives me something to focus on and believe in. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for creating this space. I do want to honor and with gratitude honor the teachings of Elder Reg Crowshoe, and just all of the elders and knowledge keepers that have helped me on my journey, because it's not been an easy one. But I challenge you to reflect on what you heard today and how that might tie into where you can take this conversation in the next couple of days, and in your education journey and in your career. And realize that we all can play a role in creating ethical space and honoring different perspectives. So I do hope to meet you in the networking session, and would love to hear from you if you have any other questions or feedback. And thanks very much.